extremes, Maecenas was actually a moderating influence on some of Octavian's more bloodthirsty tendencies. His love of soft living and the arts, though, were unmatched, which led to a tense relationship with the stolid, battle-hardened, and humorless Agrippa. In the end, the two were held together only by their mutual loyalty to Octavian, but both proved to be indispensable to their master's success. Agrippa's role was obvious. He won the great battles that put Octavian in power. But, for example, it was Maecenas' patronage of the arts that was the key to the cult of personality that would surround Caesar Augustus and keep him in power. Maecenas cultivated the leading artists and poets of the day, specifically Horace and Virgil, and engaged them in a great project to perpetually glorify his boss. In the words of Anthony Everett, Maecenas somehow managed to keep them all on message without resorting to the heavy hand of censorship, which is, I can assure you, no mean feat when dealing with independent creative types. In our discussions of the reign of Augustus, we will have much more to say about both Maecenas and Agrippa, who will play as much a role in the imperial administration as they had played in establishing it. At least from the time the donations of Alexandria were announced, the three old friends were actively plotting war with Antony. The trick was to bait him into making the first move so Octavian would not look like the aggressor. Octavian slated himself to hold the consulship for 33 BC to turn Rome against Antony. On the first day he presided over the Senate, Octavian let loose with the most inflammatory attacks he could think of. Antony was living in sin with Cleopatra in the east. Antony had betrayed the honor of blameless Octavia. Antony had illegally executed Sextus Pompey without trial. Antony started wars with foreign powers without the consent of the Senate. Antony was making himself a king. In short, Antony was the enemy of all that was good, pure, and decent about Rome. For the rest of the year, Octavian and Antony were engaged in a war of words for the hearts and minds of Romans everywhere. Antony sent letters back to the Senate that were read aloud by his supporters, claiming that Octavian had forged the adoption papers of Julius Caesar, that he was consumed with a megalomaniacal lust for power, that he was a low-born provincial who had lied, cheated, and stolen his way up the political ladder. It was also whispered that Octavian had engaged in unnatural relations with his uncle on his way back from Spain in order to win Caesar's favor. When 32 BC came around and Octavian's turn in the consulship ended, the propaganda war had played out to a near stalemate. But in provoking the confrontations, Octavian had succeeded in at least one important respect. With the triumvirate expiring December 31, 33 BC, there was no chance now that it would be renewed. The 10-year-old partnership was officially dissolved. Now the facade of collegial alliance could be dropped. They were rivals and enemies. It was time for everyone to come right out and say it. Octavian even used the occasion of the triumvirate's expiration to hit Antony with a solid body blow. He made sure he was out in front, declaring that he would no longer be addressed as triumvir as he had been for the last decade. That was all in the past. The preeminence of the consuls and the Senate had returned to Rome for good. When Antony, though, refused to give up the title he had grown accustomed to, Octavian pounced, arguing that Antony had no legal standing, no right to the title, and technically no official role in the state whatsoever. If he continued to wield executive power in the East, he was doing so illegally and usurping the power of the Senate and the consuls. He saved his best for Cleopatra, who he built up as some sort of evil sorceress who had hypnotized Antony and controlled him like a puppet. It was important that Octavian lay as much at the feet of Cleopatra as he could. He was hoping to induce the Senate into declaring war, and he knew that they would find it far easier to direct their ire at an evil foreign queen than at Mark Antony himself, who had spent his entire adult life in the service of Rome. Unfortunately for Octavian, many in the Senate weren't having these over-the-top accusations and were not ready to abandon Antony just yet. And in fact, by a stroke of luck, the two consuls for the year 32 BC also happened to be Antony loyalists. They denounced Octavian for his slander and introduced a resolution to censure young Caesar. Unwilling to accept the rebuke, Octavian was forced to reveal what everybody already knew: that despite having given up his triumvir title, he was not giving up on power. He unilaterally and illegally called a meeting of the Senate and addressed the charges brought against him, conspicuously flanked by armed bodyguards. This proved to be a fatal breach of protocol. In protest, fully 1/3 of the Senate packed their bags and left Rome, headed for Alexandria. Included in their ranks were the 2 consuls, who took with them all the official executive authority of the state. Octavian, who had for years been claiming his subservience to the Constitution, was now forced to reveal his true colors. He didn't give a whit about the Constitution. He had no official position within the state, but there was no doubt about it. Octavian ruled Rome. Later in the year, he received a gift from the East. A high-ranking defector from Alexandria brought with him the pretext that Octavian could use to finally induce a declaration of war on Antony. It seems that Antony had recently lodged a will in the Temple of the Vestas, the contents of which, if known, would finally reveal the depths of his abandonment of Rome. Octavian demanded that the Vestal virgins produce the document, but citing sacred oaths, they refused. Undeterred, Octavian simply stormed the temple and seized the will. Romans everywhere were shocked by this unthinkable violence against the temple, but when Octavian began reading passages of the document aloud, they soon forgot all about Octavian's sacrilege. Antony had left large portions of his estate to his illegitimate children, reaffirmed the claim that Caesarion was the true heir of Julius Caesar, which was, it should be noted, an impossibility within Roman law, as Cleopatra was not a citizen. But most shocking of all, he requested to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. Octavian argued that Antony had betrayed his Roman heritage and that it was high time for the Senate to recognize that he was an enemy of the state. Moved by the revelations contained in the will, the Senate, well, 2/3 of the Senate anyway, declared war on Egypt. The moment of truth had come. Octavian and Antony were finally going to face off in battle. The prize? Sole control of the Roman Empire. Antony knew what was coming down the pike as soon as 1/3 of the Senate showed up on his doorstep. The 400 ships he had built for the invasion of Parthia were soon sailing for Greece. In a crucial development, Antony decided not to lead the fleet all by himself, but appointed Cleopatra as co-general. There's no straight answer for why he chose to elevate Cleopatra to this high rank in the army, but the effect was almost wholly negative. The Romans who had fled Italy to join with Antony now found themselves subservient to a woman and a foreigner, a situation they found intolerable. This is in no way meant to knock the capabilities of Cleopatra or get bogged down in comments on Roman misogyny, but it's simply to point out that the queen's position did prove to be a corrosive acid eating slowly at the heart of morale in the Antonian camp. But Antony had ignored advice to leave her behind, or better yet, kill her and annex Egypt, and the two set sail for Greece, ready for the showdown with Octavian. By the winter of 32-31 BC, the bulk of the Antonian fleet settled into the Ambracian Gulf on the coast of the Ionian Sea. It was a curious choice of positions. When it came to strategically locating armies for east-west showdowns, the common assumptions was that the ports along the Adriatic were far more valuable. By stowing his fleet far to the south, Antony essentially ceded Octavian an opportunity to ferry ground forces from Brundisium over to Dyrrhachium. Historians have postulated that Antony and wanted to clearly signal that his intention was not to invade Italy, so he chose not to plant a huge navy off the coast of the peninsula. He may also have been concerned about keeping his supply lines from and escape route back to Egypt open. Whatever the final calculus that led to the decision was, the upshot was that with his fleet in the Ambracian Gulf, when it came time to sail out in the spring, he would have to pass the small port town of Actium, which stood at the head of the narrow entrance to the Gulf. Prior to their falling out, Octavian and Antony had been slated to share a year in the consulship in 31 BC. With Antony persona non grata in Octavian's Rome, young Caesar took his position as senior executive without Antony in the way. Octavian began to claim, not totally inaccurately, that traitorous Mark Antony was leading a foreign army against the legitimate government of Rome. It was true that Antony served no official capacity, and that his legions were led and recruited largely from the east, while Octavian, as the rightful consul, was leading armies drawn from Italy itself. But at this point, everyone knew what the score was. No one bought the hype that one side was fighting for Rome and the other side against Rome, or for the Constitution or against the Constitution. This was just two powerful men using the resources of the empire to decide once and for all which one of them would run the whole show. Octavian and Agrippa decided that their best shot against Antony, who, despite all their propaganda and slanders, they never once underestimated as a military commander, was to act boldly. Antony had set up a critical supply hub at Methone in the southwest Peloponnese. If the city could be taken, Antony would find himself without access to fresh supplies and susceptible to a maritime siege of Actium. So in March of 31 BC, before the winter was out, Agrippa led a daring run through the storming waters of the Ionian and launched a surprise assault on the city, capturing it before Antony could react. When the spring arrived, Octavian hastily ferried 50,000 ground forces across the Adriatic and marched them south. Suddenly, Antony was trapped. Octavian's forces prevented him from marching his army overland out of the Ambracian Gulf, while Agrippa's navy positioned itself off the coast and dared him to try to sail out of danger. Antony recognized immediately what a disastrous position he was in. Just as with the failed Parthian expedition, he knew that his only hope was retreat. He had to get back to Egypt and regroup, or all would be lost. And he had to do it fast, too. His men were badly undersupplied, and, trapped in confined quarters during the summer heat, were falling prey to disease, the great scourge of armies. To top things off, reports came daily listing off which high-ranking officials had slipped across the lines during the night. His allies and his gods were deserting him. Next week, Antony will make a break for it. Though at the time the Battle of Actium was an important, but not necessarily decisive victory for Octavian, history would soon be written by the victors to portray it as the great and final triumph of Octavian over the enemies of Rome. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 51, Actium. After the partnership between Antony and Octavian broke down following the dissolution of the Second Triumvirate in 32 BC, there was no longer room in the empire for both men. Everyone had long suspected that war would break out between the two triumvirs eventually. Now, that war had arrived. Once again, Romans were forced to choose sides in a civil war. I honestly feel sorry for the exhausted generations of this final century of the Republic. These men and women who were born just before Sulla's first march on Rome in 88 BC, who grew up in the vicious proscription regimes of the two feuding generals, Sulla and Marius, came of age at the time of the Catiline conspiracy, and then grew into full adulthood with Julius Caesar's civil wars raging all around them. As they moved into their 50s and 60s, ready to take on the role of elder statesmen or presiding matrons, they were caught up in the triumvirs' wars against Brutus and Cassius and then Sextus Pompey. And now, Octavian and Antony were drawing yet another bloody line in the sand. Every step of the way, these poor souls had been forced to choose sides. Choosing the right side usually meant little more than the opportunity to sacrifice something valuable to the victor, be it land or treasure, while choosing the wrong side usually meant exile and death. While it was true that many were staunch partisans of one side or another, most were just average men and women trying to live their lives, for whom these conflicts were never black and white. On this side was their son, on that side their brother. Their father had been killed by this man, but their daughter's life was now inextricably linked to his success. It was never easy. Every choice, every year, came with more heartache and suffering. The history of their nation was riddled with tales of patriotic solidarity